Hi, and welcome to What's Up, where your host, Wat Fanar, tell you what's up with me. So, this is a little late, as you can probably tell. So, the reason it's a little late, partially is because I have been recording stuff to go inside the podcasts. My big problem was that I was planning on doing the news on Sunday, which ended up being April Fool's Day, which then meant I didn't trust any of my news sites. And this kind of put me in a bit of a problem of not getting around to things. And I really thought that news was an important part of things that needs to be added into things. The other big reason, which is probably less professional, is that I have been both busy working and busy playing SteamWorld games. There will be a review later on of SteamWorld games, so here's a quick spoiler. I've lost lots of time playing them. Oh yes, this is. Sorry, I'm recording this quite into April now, but we've just started April. This is supposed to be the Just Started April podcast. It's been quite good for me because I'm actually doing more in making my New Year's resolutions happen now than I was at the beginning of the year, which for me is a really big thing and something that I think is pretty rare across the board. I've been doing more exercise and slightly healthier than I was at the beginning of the year. I've definitely working harder, definitely just across the board doing more stuff, taking better care of my teeth, which is an issue for another time. But yeah, overall, I've been doing well, playing more games, and yeah, so I'm pretty chuffed with myself with this year. And now that we're sort of a quarter of the way through the year, to sort of look back at it and go, oh look, I'm still working on being a better person and doing a good job at progressing at those things. So that is how I've been going. For now, I'm just keeping these on YouTube now rather than SoundCloud. Okay, yes, some housekeeping. Yes, the title screen's still rubbish, and that's because I've been a bit too busy to get around to doing any graphics, and I still haven't set up the Patreon to help pay for this. That is also something I've not got around to. Also, I've not got around to... and without this, without any money coming in from Patreon, it turns out that the amount that SoundCloud is going to charge me to keep uploading these things onto SoundCloud, from what I can tell, means that this probably isn't on SoundCloud. So that will have to be a sort of stretch goal thing on Patreon. And those things are not going to happen anytime soon either. It's definitely going to be at least 2 weeks before I get back on those things, probably towards the end of the month. Because I have a really busy week ahead of me. So I'm sorry, I am keeping up with the podcasts because I'm enjoying making these, and I'm going to try and keep that momentum going. So yes, let's get on with the podcast. We have the news this week. I have a little rant about mediums, artistic mediums, not people who can tell the future. That's a totally different rant. No, artistic mediums and what different mediums mean to me, and how different mediums affect how you tell stories. And yeah, I've got a whole talk about it. I don't need to tell you now. And finally, as I said, I have the review of SteamWorld Dig and SteamWorld Dig 2. So enjoy. Next, I'd like to cover the news. So we're going to start off with sort of film and TV. So the first thing that sort of really cropped up and made me interested was the report that it looks like Netflix is going to buy out Luc Besson's film company. Luc Besson is the writer and director of The Fifth Element as well as Valerian, both of which are two of the most stunning movies, sci-fi movies ever made. In fact, probably the top two. And I'm interested to see what he's going to do. He also wrote and directed Leon and La Femme Nikita. I'm not gonna lie, he is if you look at his track record, he has had relationships with girls who are scarily close to the age of consent, and sort of occasionally had performers he has sort of worked with who he's then sort of started dating pretty much as soon as they turned legal. I really like his content. I like his sci-fi stuff. He also wrote Taken and several other things. He's an impressive artist. I won't lie. If I were to have a daughter, or really a child of any age, I would not trust him on set. I don't think he should be allowed to make kids stuff, and I do know he does have a kids series. I don't think he should be allowed to do that, and I certainly wouldn't trust him with any children's stars. However, if you go outside of that and go off into, things that he creates with people who are way past the age that it's dodgy, I kind of like what he does. I'm interested to see what he can do with Netflix. Like I said, he makes such visually amazing things that if Netflix are happy to give him the budget, I think that could be really interesting. On the other hand, he's a Frenchman, if the name Luc Besson did not give it away. And so a lot of what he's got in... so he's made an awful lot of just arty French films as well, and his company has made quite a lot of those. So this could end up being totally useless for me, because I want him to make crazy sci-fi. And yeah, so hopefully there's something sort of interesting there. But I guess we'll see as that goes forward what that becomes. So next up we have so the next thing I sort of want to talk about is kind of connected in that idea of sort of originality and franchising. In my head, those things were connected. I realise now, having said that they weren't connected at all. But you see, in my head, sort of, this is about sort of Luc Besson generally makes original content. Admittedly, Valerian isn't, but and arguably Fifth Element is sort of based on the Inkle, but he makes such big, vibrant, and visually stunning pieces and interesting worlds, and isn't selling his films based on... Because I mean, very few people who went to go and see Valerian had ever heard of Valerian before it actually turned up in cinemas, so he's definitely making those films not based as strongly on the source material and much more strongly based on an original vision. So that's why those things were connected to me. On the other side, as I reported in the last podcast, the Donald Glover Deadpool animated series is dead. And now Donald Glover has issued a rather interesting fake script, which is a giant metaphor for everything that he thinks went wrong in production, at which he postulates that perhaps it was a race problem because he had an all-black writer's room, but he ultimately comes to the conclusion that the problem is that Marvel wants to play everything safe. And that he was trying to put in risky political material and was trying to put in more modern references that young people would understand. Like, in fairness, I read it as an annotated version, and I think there are about 3 references that I did get, and an awful lot that I didn't, because there's quite a few rap references that I'm unfamiliar with, and there was some modern celebrity gossip, which again, not something I keep up with. But there was a joke about video games, and I got that one. It was in particular a Fortnite reference, which isn't even a game I play, but I understood the reference. And yeah, he's sort of doing that sort of... The problem is that they weren't willing to take the chance on him, and sort of also came to the conclusion that it was probably for the best that his Deadpool never got made, because now he'll get to go off and make his own thing. I full-heartedly agree with this, because I think that we should always be making new content. There's a lot more I have to say about his conclusions, and in particular, he sort of postulates that perhaps the thing that will make Marvel become obsolete is its lack of willingness to take risks. And I really do feel like it would be one thing if Donald Glover was the only person to have said this, but sort of most of my favourite filmmakers have been chucked off Star Wars projects now. Like, Lord and Miller I love and got chucked off Solo. Disney projects rather than Marvel projects. They got chucked off the Han Solo film, which also stars Donald Glover. Donald Glover's been chucked off this. Edgar Wright got chucked out of Ant-Man. I do think that Marvel's making a good product, but there is clearly a level of problem that is going on there that, I think I really want to talk about this more, so I think this is going to be its own featured section, and so look for that. I currently have no idea what the order of these things are going to go up on, so that could be later this podcast or in 1 or 2 podcasts' time. But there is a full article on film franchises, and it will probably be called something like How to Save Hollywood or something. But yes, that is the news. But yes, it's an interesting script. Do check it out just from an interesting perspective to say, okay, what's he saying in the script? What's he doing? It's a really interesting project, and it's always nice to watch someone have a giant meltdown in a public venue. So I approve of that. Donald Glover's fake Deadpool script. Next, we have we're not getting very far from the topic. Same topic. Duncan Jones apparently reached out to DC Entertainment, asking them if he could have the rights to a comic called Prez, which was about the first teenage president. Really, he basically wants to sort of do a parody of what's currently going on with the political landscape, and this was sort of a way of him doing this. It turns out, firstly, DC didn't know they had the rights, so he spent a while trying to convince them that they did have the rights and to give it to him. And secondly, DC came back with a, no, we're focusing on our core market. Which is just really stupid. And then on top of it just being basically, if anyone's saying, can I buy something off of you? And you're like, no, we want to focus on... Like, it can kind of make sense. Like, you wouldn't want to make 2 Batman canons at the same time. Okay, so I understand that. But this seems to be pretty separate enough that it wouldn't be a huge problem for their cinematic universe. Not that their cinematic universe deserves preservation right now, but... And then the other thing that's weird about it is that... Okay, so it reminds me of a story that I heard quite recently, which was that when Sony bought the rights of Spider-Man to make the Spider-Man movies, they were offered the rights to everything that Marvel owned at the time for, I think, about double the price. It was sort of you can have Spider-Man, or for double the price you can have Spider-Man, Captain America, Iron Man, Ant-Man. Pretty much anything that's currently part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe was being offered. I think they'd already sold X-Men, the X-Men franchise, to and the Fantastic Four to Fox at the time. I think so. So I think that wasn't included, but basically it was everything that was there. And Sony sort of, when the person came, the representative of Sony went to his boss and was like, hey, would you like all of these guys? And Sony turned to them and said, no one cares about them. All we care about is Spider-Man. Nobody cares about anyone else. Now, in hindsight, it does have a look like that was a giant mistake, because clearly Iron Man and Captain America and Thor are all making, and Black Panther are all making huge amounts of money at the box office. Guardians of the Galaxy, like, clearly they made a mistake. Except, the thing is that they didn't. And the reason is because those movies would not have been made if Sony owned the rights to all of those movies. Because Sony always wanted to make Spider-Man films. And really, they'd have just made Spider-Man films in which Iron Man turns up. They would never give Iron Man his his own movie. And so, because of that, you wouldn't have that same starting point. And I think really allowing... the Marvel Cinematic Universe came from a fact that Disney had bought Marvel, and they didn't have rights to Spider-Man, and they didn't have rights to the X-Men, who are by far their biggest franchises. And so they kind of got left with the B team. And yes, I do consider pretty much everyone in the Marvel Cinematic Universe to be the B team. If you'd have asked me to name Marvel characters beforehand, um, I would have gone straight for the X-Men, who are wonderful. I would have gone through Spider-Man. Um, I mean, there are definitely. I knew about Iron Man and Captain America and the Hulk. The Hulk was probably one of the biggest of those. Like, I could have named those. Me being a comic book nerd, knew about Ant-Man / Giant Man, and Wasp, and some of those other characters. Oh, Hawkeye and Black Widow. But, like, particularly once you really go beyond that and you're like, the Guardians of the Galaxy, I barely knew who they were. Black Panther, I just about knew who he was. Yeah, there are a lot of weird characters who are now sort of getting their own films and features who were pretty much sort of would never have seen the light of day if the studios were choosing what films they were making, because the first film they'd make is the Spider-Man film and the Fantastic Four, and that's again one of those things that DC kind of got wrong, which was they started off with their biggest character, and starting off with your biggest character is a problem. Like, it makes a lot better sense to work up, and really it should go from least powerful to most powerful, and slowly up the level as you introduce characters into the film, which is why it works so well in the way that they did it, where they start off with Iron Man, who is a human with tech. Then they moved up to Captain America, who is a super soldier. Then they move up to the Hulk and Thor, who are bigger characters. And then they move to the Avengers, which is a group of people. And then they start moving into outer space. The idea of them slowly leveling up just worked better that way. And yeah. Also, someone recently pointed out to me that by the time they reach the fourth Avengers film, it will have been 22 movies out, and that realistically the Marvel Cinematic Universe is actually one giant TV series, and they're just spending, hundreds of millions per episode. And I really liked the idea of that. But yes, so DC denied Duncan Jones the right to minor properties, and that's just silly on their part, but oh well. Speaking of silly things, there is currently what can only be described as a really silly game on Kickstarter. It's called Fireball Island. There was a very old game called Fireball Island back when board games didn't have to be good. They just had to be gimmicky. We used to have this whole time before the internet where it was very hard to know if something was good. Because it's not like there were toy review magazines out there, or even toy review shows. So really, if you wanted to know if a toy was any good, you were looking at the box and then sort of trying to decide if it was any good. Or you had to wait for one of your friends to buy it and then play with their copy to find out if it was any good. And with board games, again, it was very much the same thing. And this is why you end up with a lot of board games that look impressive and seem cool, particularly like during the 80s and 90s. Like, there were all of these games which look really cool, but are actually just awful games. I think probably the most famous example in the UK would be Mousetrap, which is basically just to roll the dice and move around the board. But the gimmick is that you're putting together this giant machine where Rube Goldberg machine, where everything bumps into everything else, and there's a real joy to setting it up and spinning the crank that hits the thing that bashes the ball that goes duk 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 duk, then lands on a seesaw, which makes another ball go into a bathtub, and I missed a whole load of steps there. I'm really annoyed at myself, but nevertheless, the point was, oh yeah, after the duk 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 thing, it went down the little rain guttering, then it hit the stick with the hand, which then hit the ball into which hit the seesaw, which hit the diver into the bathtub, which bashed the thing, which went. Those of you who know what I'm talking about, that made total sense too. Everyone else, I'm sorry. Anyway, so one of the games that people made during this time, where a game that sounded cool was more important than a game that played well, was a game called Fireball Island. And Restoration Games have put a lot of effort into remaking this game. Now, admittedly, their version of the game is not the original, and their version of the game is significantly better than the original. The idea of the game was there's a giant volcano in the middle of the board, and it's a giant plastic board. It's basically a plastic shell. And then, because it's a 3D board, you have a whole load of marbles, and sometimes you'll drop a whole load of marbles, and the marbles will go down these various paths, and a lot of the spaces that you roll and move through will have you waiting on a path, and so sometimes it's like, I need to make sure no one puts any marbles in, and if people do put marbles, you're like, oh, which path is it going to go down? And so they've remade this game. And they clearly had a lot of fun with it. It's a much bigger game. They even created sort of loads of extra sideboards that never existed in the original. And there are lots of things like bridges which get knocked over and stuff. I do think they've improved it. They've definitely put in a few more ways to control the way that things roll. In particular, sort of like there are trees which basically work like the things in trains that change the tracks. I can't think of the right word. I'm waving my hand from side to side like that would work in a podcast. But anyway, the things that can change which direction things are going. So they do seem to have put a fair amount of effort into this game. And if you want something ridiculous to play, this might be the game that for you. I do feel like it's a game that's probably you're only going to play with guests around and only play a few times. It's not a game that you're going to want to bring out every single week, but yeah, it's a thing, and if that interests you, then go for it. Just sort of bridging the gap between video games and board games. So the YouTuber Angry Joe has brought a Street Fighter miniatures game to the Kickstarter. I will say that the miniatures all look amazing. They're sort of about amiibo size and full 3D and full painted and got some 3D effects in them, and with like transparent and whooshy and sort of special effect pieces. And the thing is that the game looks fairly playable. That's came off sounding worse than it is. The game looks totally fine. The thing is that the game doesn't look like Street Fighter to me. Because firstly, it's not really designed for two players. It's designed for you to be able to play with multiple players, which isn't really Street Fighter. It's got a lot of throwing people into items and possibly bashing people through items, which isn't really Street Fighter. And you play on this sort of chessboard type thing. It's got a very nice. It doesn't look like a chessboard. It's sort of it's got scenery and things on it, but the idea is, it's sort of about 8 squares by 8 squares. And it's got that sort of, you're moving around a 3D environment. And there's lots of really nice 3D terrain and things. It's just not very Street Fighter. Like, if he'd have called it, if he'd have got the Streets of Rage franchise, this would feel more appropriate because you play it with friends and you sort of move around and the game itself doesn't seem to have anything massively new. It's got an interesting comboing system. It's got a little bit of bluffing and sort of trying to work out what you're going to do when your opponent tries to do it. It's just not Street Fighter, which really bugs me because I own a really good not Street Fighter game. In this case, it's not Street Fighter. So the game's called BattleCon. There are 2 versions of it. Well, there are at least 2 versions of it. I don't know. There's one which is War of Indines and one which is the Devastation of Indines. And don't ask me to do that. It's by Level 99 Games. It's BattleCon. Search for those things and you'll find it. The first game is... I really like the first game, but it's the original first copy, which is what I have. All of the characters are very... the production budget clearly went up when they made the second game. The first BattleCon was Level 99's first game, so the cards are all fine, but like the player board and the punch outs are tiny. And there are lots of little bits that can and do get lost. But that's a game which is... it's basically... For years, Street Fighter fans would tell me that Street Fighter is chess, and the problem was that I couldn't play... That I'm not a Street Fighter player. That once you know all of the moves of Street Fighter, making decisions is very sort of... Are you going? If I do this, you're going to do this, and it becomes the meta game becomes much more chess-like. BattleCon is pretty much that. You actually have a very small number of cards, and the idea is that you have sort of left-hand cards and right-hand cards, and the right-hand cards are the same for everyone, and the left-hand cards are unique to your character. So you basically have a set of moves which everyone has, which are sort of things like fire a burst shot in sort of like a Hadouken type thing. There's a grapple, hit someone from a small distance. Also, it has a 2D map because that's what Street Fighter's like. And it has things like... sorry, yeah, I'll carry on. Yeah, so it then has sort of like a strike and a move, and that move can be used to sort of jump over the person and then avoid that their attack doesn't land. The other side has all of the cool stuff that makes your character cool, whether it's a character who slowly levels up, or there's a character with a gun and each of his bullets has special powers. In the later games, they sort of made a group of characters. So there's a character who is just really overpowered and gives your opponent bonuses every time he hits them to sort of balance the scales. So yeah, so the left-hand cards and the right-hand cards go together to sort of make your move. And they even have the name, so you sort of, if it's a strike, it's then sort of like a vital strike or a massive strike or a penetrating strike or whatever it is. And the numbers all get added together, so your character can be a high range or a low range character because, like that guy with all of the bullets, he's going to have lots of things which add range to the base stat. But because you only have, I think you only have 5 move cards, maybe 6 move, sorry, 6 6 cards special to your character. And then I think there's maybe 7 basic move cards. And then on top of that, every time you move a card, it takes 2 turns to cool down. So you only ever have a small number of options, because especially once you've removed 2 of your, I think it is 5 cards for your special character and 7 basic moves. So you then only have 8 cards in your hand, 3 of which can be one side, 5 of which can be the other, which does limit what you can do. And so your opponent, who knows, if you play it really well, your opponent might know everything that you're trying to do. In the second version of the game, they did give a printout so you could hand over a character card, so your opponent could have a quick reference to work out what it was you had in your hand. And that was most of the game. Because there was a sort of priority was a big part of it, and range was a big part of it, being faster than your opponent and preparing for their attack was very important, because if you could just walk out of there, if they did their biggest move and you walk away and you're one outside of their range, they do their move and they miss. There's a lot more to it than that, but and particularly the second game added huge amounts of extra modes, as well as making a much bigger board, which is easier to play with. It's definitely, the second edition was better. It had way more characters as well. I think I own both versions, and the first game came with, I think, 12 characters, and then the second one came with, I think, it was over 20. So I've got sort of 30 characters, and they all do play differently. I have not got to play anywhere near enough of it, and it is a very good 2-player game. It's very good for playing. You can play it against different skill levels. There are ways that you can slightly tweak it to turn someone into a boss. So if you want to do 2 versus 1 and team up, there's even the first game has rules for tag teaming and special areas and things. So there's a lot to that game. It's well worth picking up if you like Street Fighter and board games. I can also tell you that you will be able to play it a lot. If you want to pick up a game, let's say you want to pick up a game for the summer holidays and you are going to play this game every day of the holidays, this is a game that will hold up, because the sheer amount of characters and locations and extra rules, all of the characters have multiple finishers and multiple, sometimes they even came out with alternate cards for some of the characters, so you could play them the same. They played just slightly differently, but with the same cards. There was some really interesting stuff. This wasn't supposed to be a review of BattleCon. I may come back to it at some point. But yes, BattleCon, really good game. If that's the sort of thing you want, go for it. On the other hand, if you want really good looking Street Fighter miniatures, look at the Street Fighter miniature game. It definitely looks good. It might even be fun to play. I mean, it being on Kickstarter, I obviously haven't played it. It looks like it's got potential to be fun to play. So it just doesn't feel like Street Fighter. Nah. Okay, now on to real video game news. Um, okay, so this was the thing that I was most putting off doing the news for. Because I put off the news because I was trying to root out April Fool's jokes. And Ark, the dinosaur survival game, is basically getting a Minecraft-like look version called PixArk, and I'll be honest, I was totally convinced that was going to be an April Fool's joke. It's not, apparently. Apparently, this is a real thing. I don't really understand why this exists. I think Ark is a really good game. Is a good game from what I've seen of it. It has giant spiders in it, so I don't play it. But if it didn't have giant spiders in it, I would totally play that game because it looks really cool and fun. Minecraft, of course, classically amazing game. I don't really see what mixing the two together actually gives anyone. I feel like if you want to play Minecraft, you should play Minecraft, and if you want to play Ark, you should play Ark. And I don't really feel like there's enough of a the middle ground doesn't feel like it adds enough new to either of them that it really seems interesting to me. It just baffles me. And it's made by the people who made Ark as well. It's not even like someone had seen the two things and wanted to put their own spin on it. It's by the same company. Anyway, if that interests you, that's a thing. Speaking of things that interest me, a lot of things actually got announced. There are quite a few things being remade. One of which is Mark of the Ninja, which is an amazing game. And it being remastered doesn't overly interest me, but it coming out on the Switch does. So I'm kind of excited for that. On top of that, Spyro the Dragon, the original ones by Insomniac, which are pretty amazing games. Spyro 3 in particular is fantastic. Spyro Year of the Dragon. And they are games that totally need updating. You try and replay them, and they're just... they were great for what they were at the time. At the time, what they were doing was groundbreaking. But when you go back to it and you look at it, like some pictures of this remastered series. It's called Reignited Trilogy. But when you compare them side by side from what it used to look like to what it looks like now, that was well done. And it's by the people who updated the Crash Bandicoot, who I think most people were quite positive about that. I was never a Crash Bandicoot fan. But yes, that looks amazing, and it will be coming out on... It looks like it's coming out on everything. For me, that means it's coming out on the Switch, because apparently I have become a Switch player. I will come back to that in just a sec. Speaking of other things that are getting remastered, they're remaking Red Faction Guerrilla. This does not look like they've been putting huge amounts of extra stuff into it. Like, I'm fairly confident they're using the same models. I'm not really sure what they've changed. However, Red Faction Guerrilla is an amazing game, and I thoroughly recommend it to all. And if the lack of 4K was what was stopping you from buying that game for some reason, then you should pick up this version. Oh, sorry, I've finally read the end of it. Apparently, if you already own it on Steam, you will get the remastered version for free. So, I probably already own it. If they decide to bring this out on Switch, though, that may possibly be of interest to me. Yeah, we're getting back to that. I found out that I just play games on Switch that I don't play elsewhere. And in particular, there is a type of game which is sort of a game. I just enjoy playing games on Switch. Mostly because I can multitask a lot. Like, sometimes you have a really immersive game and you want that game to sort of be everything, and sometimes there's a game that only takes up 50% of your mental capacity. And I like those games to have something going on in the background while I'm playing the game. And that's, for me, that's a lot of games. Basically anything that isn't story-based. I generally like to be watching something in the background while I play things. I have now recently started taking this one step further, particularly with Switch games, in that so long as I don't have to think too hard, and I'm not reading, I've started walking on the spot and attempting to do some exercise with some ankle weights on. So walking on the spot while playing games while watching TV. That's multitasking at its best. No, multitasking at its best is watching films while playing games and eating junk food. That's definitely the best. But I'm pretty happy with my multitasking as well. Yes, so reason I was kind of bringing this up is one of the things that I've totally been grabbed by recently has been the SteamWorld series on Switch. I will be reviewing that more in a proper review in, again, the next few weeks. Maybe this episode. Who knows what went and ended up where. But if you are a Switch, a Twitch Prime member, then SteamWorld Dig 2, Tokyo 42, Kingsway, Dub Wars, and Tales from the Borderland are all coming out as your sort of free download things. And as I'm definitely excited about Kingsway, Tokyo 42, and I've just finished SteamWorld Dig on my Switch. Admittedly, I feel like Tokyo 42 and Kingsway, even though they're free with Twitch, will not get played very much because being on my PC, and my PC is how I watch content, because really I only watch stuff on sort of Netflix and Amazon Prime and things. And that being my only monitor in my house means that sort of I can't multitask it properly. So, I mean, that's still a great set of games, but so if you're a Twitch Prime follower, grab those. I believe that's this month. But yeah, on some more interesting, weird games, there is an interesting game that I saw a trailer for called Kine, spelt Kine, because I would never be able to spell that from how it sounded. Let's be honest, I can't spell Spider-Man. I'm not sure if Spider-Man is an easy one to spell, but yeah. So it's a music-based puzzle game where the big thing is basically you have each instrument is... The best way to think of it is instruments who sort of have stretchy arms, which can turn them into rectangles. Well, no, cuboids. Um, and the instrument, so the piano section, when the piano starts playing, is going to change size depending on what it's playing. The bass and drum kit's going to be controlled by it, and whatever the other things are. And the idea is that they're going to be changing size depending on what's going on. So you need to work out how to move in time to the music so that you can navigate the puzzles, but you'll need to do it in time and learn the patterns. It looks like the sort of game that's really interesting, and I will never be able to play because I have no musical talent. I have interesting stories about my lack of musical talent, but I'm sure it will come up again. And I've already gone off on enough tangents with the BattleCon talk this news cycle, so I'm gonna leave it there. But it looks interesting, and if you like music and puzzle games, definitely have a look out for that. On games I'm much more likely to actually play, there is a game called Semblance, SEM Balance, in which you play a character who is sort of stretchy and can deform, and you can also deform the level, which means that sort of when things were going to point in one direction by sort of... It's got a fair amount of like laser puzzles. Sorry, it's 2D platformer. And yeah, but it's not sort of like you add stuff. It's a lot more sort of like, here's a wall of lasers, and then you move the wall so that it sticks out in front of the lasers, and then you've got a sort of safe part to go through. It looks weird in the sort of way that I love. So yeah, that's something to keep an eye out for. And then the final three pieces of news, which I'll quickly put back to back, is really the three games that I'm looking forward to most this year. All came out with release dates. And they are all coming out back to back. So, yeah. So the first one is Chasm, which is a Metroidvania, which is one of my favourite types of game. It was on Kickstarter ages ago, and I have probably already put 10 hours into this game. I think I played the demo for the Kickstarter a good 4 times, and it was an hour-long demo or so. And then I backed at an alpha level, so I got access to the alpha. And so I've played that 3 times, I think. And that's sort of got to sort of 2-3 hours. So I have put a lot of time into this game already, and I don't have access to all of the areas. This is one of the few times that I feel like procedural generation really works. Mostly because, particularly with Metroidvanias, it's very hard to get a procedurally generated world that's actually captures the Metroidvania, because Metroidvanias are really about exploring and discovering things, but they're also kind of puzzling, they're kind of a lot of things. And there being very strict structure to sort of what you want to, how to unlock things and being able to come back and open things. That kind of all gets screwed up when you procedurally generate too much stuff. And particularly if you're doing something like Rogue Legacy, where you procedurally generate every single time you go into something, you totally lose what it is that makes a Metroidvania a Metroidvania. This game, it only procedurally generates at the beginning of the game, and then you stick with that game, that procedural generation, and it never changes. So while you're playing through the game, it will never change. It's only what you play through and what other people play through that's different. They also have a lot of key rooms that are linked. And the way that they mix those key rooms together is often, from what I've played of it, and as I said, I've played quite a bit of it, they've done a really good job of having those key skills and how you get those key skills sort of add together, but still having that sort of every time you play it, it plays differently, which is one of those things where it's like the reason I played the beta 2 or 3 times is because each time it played differently. And so there's that sort of different feel to the game. It is still more in the Castlevania feel than the Metroidvania feel, which is a discussion I will have some other time. But yeah, it's a really interesting game. I'm really looking forward to it. And unfortunately, I'd be looking forward to it just a little bit more if it was on the Switch. But nevertheless, I will definitely be playing it at least once when it's come out, because it's been several years since they released a beta, and they keep changing it. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to that, and hopefully that will be coming out soon. Well, we now know it will be coming out in the summer, which is the more vague of our timelines. And then in September, we have, September the 7th, we have Insomniac's Spider-Man game, which I'm very excited for, because I love Insomniac. They've made a lot of dud games, but they've made a lot of great games too. And I choose to keep focusing on that. But I think in particular, this feels like Insomniac is best when it's trying to be fun. And I think they're at their worst when they're trying to play for kids. Which, considering they make a lot of games that are suitable for kids, like Ratchet & Clank and Spyro, are all suitable for kids, but I don't feel like they were made for kids. Like, they're really made for a teenage audience, and it's made for all ages. It's family friendly rather than kid friendly, and I feel like they've occasionally with the Ratchet & Clank series gone with let's make this just for kids, and it's generally sucked. And occasionally they've said, let's make this just for mature audiences, and it's generally sucked. But generally, when they say, let's make something and it can just be fun, that's when they're at their best. And that's what I'm really hoping. It's where Ratchet & Clank has always worked at its best. It's where Spyro worked well. It's where, from what I understand, Resistance did its best. And Sunset Overdrive, again, I don't own an Xbox One, so I have not played that one. But it looks interesting. It's one of the only Xbox One exclusives that actually make me want to own an Xbox One. But yes, they've been announcing loads of stuff all over the place. The various editions they're going to release. It looks like they're focusing on being able to make your own costumes, and the costumes having special moves. So there'll be some extra moves and extra costumes if you pre-order it. And they've only told us a few of those, but we'll slowly be releasing those. And then on top of that, they're not forcing you overly into any particular costume. I think you're going to have a collection, each costume will have a number of slots that you can equip other costumes' abilities for. The details are still pretty vague, but yes, lots of information has been coming out about that. I'm really looking forward to it, so that's why it's here. And then the last one is that Shadow of the Tomb Raider is coming out September the 14th, which, considering we've got Spider-Man coming out on the 7th and Tomb Raider coming out on the 14th, September's going to be a really busy gaming month. This is the third Tomb Raider game of the new franchise, and the first Tomb Raider game I bought because I was hyped for it to be like Uncharted, and it wasn't really very good at being like Uncharted, and it wasn't very good at being like Tomb Raider. I think I rather enjoyed the way that it designed its weapon upgrades, and that was my favourite part of the game, which is not good, especially not for a Tomb Raider game. Yeah, the plot is pretty bad. Mostly it's pretty bad because it just spent too much time caring about characters. It suffered from... In Batman, I think Batman Arkham City did it the most for me. I had a big problem with Batman Arkham City where you'd put someone down and say, stay here, and then later on you'd come back and that person had vanished. And you're like, seriously, I need to make people safe after I leave them alone because they keep getting re-kidnapped by extra by extra villains. The first Tomb Raider kind of had that undertone. Like, you were supposedly had this group of friends, but mostly you just went through and kept rescuing them until most of them got killed off. And honestly, in that game, I was so happy when they were being killed off because I wouldn't have to keep chasing after them. There were also... because the first game did have a few challenge temples, but they were like all optional, and all of them were like, oh yeah, and by the time you'd got into the puzzle, it was over. It felt like the warm-up puzzle where it was like, oh, here's a mechanic, I'm going to teach you how to use it. Now the actual puzzle's coming where you'll have to use it. Only it wasn't. It was just sort of the tutorial for all of these puzzles, pretending that was somehow tricky. So yeah, the first game's awful. I mean, not truly awful. It's also very gory. There's an awful lot of effort it's putting into things like Lara almost being raped and things, which is just not particularly fun. No, I'm going to take that back. Like, games don't have to be fun. It's just not necessary for the character. And on top of that, sort of considering how violent Lara Croft becomes, especially in this game where I think other people had this more than me because I can't shoot for toffee, but the sort of, oh no, you were going to kill someone, so you're bad guys, and then Lara goes around killing everyone in that game. And yet the thing is it's just so much more of a third-person shooter than it is a Discovery game, and it's not even well done in the interaction in the way that Uncharted is, so it really fell flat. So I totally missed Rise of the Tomb Raider. In fact, I almost missed it twice because it was an Xbox One exclusive for a while. And then by the time I finally got round to playing it, it was just sort of I think I was particularly depressed and it was on a Humble Bundle or something. And I was like, fine, I'll play this, and was shocked by just how really good it was. And they clearly had learnt their lesson from the first game, and it was much more better at its sort of minor Metroidvania-y sort of coming back to things and things changing. Very few characters were going off and being annoying. I'm not going to say the plot was great, but the plot was computery game plot. It got me to the places I needed to be, but a lot of it had good puzzle work, it had good sort of exploration and platforming and discovering, and it was fun. It was really good fun, and that made me easily excited enough that I'm looking forward to the next one. In fact, I'd almost got worried that they'd cancelled it, because I believe the same company is also working on the Avengers video game, and I was a bit worried they might have cancelled the series. So I'm hoping that this is going to pick up and do even more puzzle work than the second game. But we don't know much about it right now. So, yeah. The end of the news is basically the summer. I'm going to be busy. Next, I'd like to talk about art mediums. In particular, I'm trying to answer the question that one of you asked, Page May 316 asked, on the What Happened with the Book. So, on the off chance that you're talking about the book that Dan from Nerdcubed is working on, he's still working on that. That's going along pretty well as far as I understand it. If you're talking about the novel that I tried to do on this channel, which I'm hoping is what you asked, that's what what I'm going to talk about now. So, for me, writing a novel is something that... So, art mediums are not all the same. I mean, that's pretty obvious, but sort of, you know, the way we consume these things is different, but also what you try and get out of a medium is different. You don't see people dancing in art galleries, and equally, you don't see people playing movies. There are reasons these things are different, and because how your audience interacts and receives the data changes, it very much changes what you can do with these things. And so, and equally, as a creator of anything, what you want to say and how you want to say it, you're going to have preferences for some mediums over others. And for me, the highest calling has always been film and TV, and filmy in particular. Film is sort of my holy grail for emotions and bringing out a strong feeling in me. It's a little bit of everything, but it does a really great job of capturing me. And ideally, my dream job would be directing films, and writing films as a writer-director. Working in TV is very good too. I think I probably watch more TV than I do films, and I think that TV has a lot of potential that films don't. The big problem I have with TV, and no doubt this will become more apparent as I go into my my favourite films versus my favourite television programmes as we go, as this podcast continues. But for me, there's very much... the beauty of films is, firstly, that they have a beginning, middle and end, and secondly, it's incredibly easy to make memorable films. Just based on the fact that Star Wars and Star Trek are both very successful products in the sci-fi world, and yet the number of people who have watched the entirety of the first Star Wars film is so much higher than the number of people who have watched all of Star Trek, because all of Star Trek is a very big thing to cover. And although small parts of Star Trek, particularly things that happen over and over again, like the opening speech, people might be able to quote, the soundtrack, Picard calling Riker number one or saying engage, like, these are things that go beyond and everyone sort of knows these things. But, you know, the I'm a doctor, not a scientist, damn it. Things like that are sort of people know. But it's very hard to quote exact examples of things, particularly in the original Star Trek, and people know what you're talking about, because TV, it's hard to watch the original series of Star Trek. It's very much of its time, and TV's got so much better. Going to things like Deep Space Nine are much better watch, but even then, there's so much of it that it's very hard to say, watch all of this. And on top of that, and this is less true of Star Trek, but very much true of other programs, is that shows just go on forever. There's no end. Whereas, because movies have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and admittedly, even in Star Wars, they do seem to keep making sequels for it, but a good movie, and I'm aware that this doesn't apply to nearly all of Marvel, but sort of good movies do have beginning, middles, and ends, and the fact that it has a beginning, middle, and end, or at worst a trilogy, means that you can go through themes and you can watch those things and you can do your sort of... It's very easy to do a Back to the Future marathon. It's very hard to do a Friends marathon. I don't recommend Friends because I don't like it, but sort of if you do like Friends, as the American TV program, like it's, 9-10 seasons? And each season is 22, or 20, this was an awful example. Forget I said Friends. But if you want to do a long-running TV program, particularly American programs, it just takes so much effort to do a binge watch, because the binge watch of every episode back to back is a marathon, just weeks and weeks, because you are doing, to watch an American TV series as opposed to the British sitcoms where, they did sort of 6 episodes was the standard. Like, that is basically a movie in length. A long movie, but a movie nonetheless. Because they tended to be half an hour, so you'd end up with, 2.5 hour... 3 hours. Go on, I can do maths. I have a physics degree. So 3 hours is a fine for binge watching, but when you've got American series where you've got that all of those seasons back to back, it just becomes an impossible task. And the fact that it's an impossible task means that people don't do it. Even shows that I love, like Scrubs, for example. Scrubs is one of my preferred TV shows. At some point, I will do a proper review of it. But that has such a hard sell to it, because there is that sort of... It has good bits and it has bad bits. Like, the first half of Season 5 is awful and the second half of Season 5 is amazing. And so you have this bit where it's like trying to judge how good Scrubs is. It's really tricky because there are sections which are bad, and sometimes it's like, oh, you have to get through those bits. And sometimes it's sort of like, well, those bits sort of get in the way. Like the last season, for example, and I mean the actual last season, not the first season of a spin-off that got failed and then sort of has been repurposed as a last season. Like, the proper last season was... a lot of the actors were only intermittently appearing in it, and it had some very nice moments, but it also had some sort of some filler in it. And because it had this huge amounts of filler and lower episodes, like, I can understand people saying, well, that didn't feel right, but the ending was so perfect that you kind of do need it. And a lot of TV shows don't make my top lists, which probably do deserve it, just because they don't have a proper ending. It's the sort of, hey, we've got this really great show, and then they keep making it, and then because they never quite finish it. This is the very problem that, like, Voyager has, for example, in that Voyager has a very clear end point. And for the first season, it's great. And then the more it goes on, the more you realise it's never going to reach its end point until you actually end the show. And because of that, it sort of loses all of its focus and falls into a giant mess. And that's the problem that a lot of TV has, which is why I think that film is such a better medium. Not because I'm an elitist, but because I think that it's almost impossible for TV shows to have the same focus and the same control, because it's really hard for a creator to stand up and go, no, this is the end of my show. Whereas it's really, because if everyone keeps turning up for the, take Dan Harmon with Community. It's very hard for Dan Harmon to stand up and go, nope, the show's ending now and that's the end. Because even if the studio was on his side, which it never was, like, there's a whole load of people who come to work every day because they work on Community. And if he says, nope, that's the end, I don't want the next season, even if everyone else does, a whole load of people just don't have jobs, and that's an issue. Whereas with films, there's no expectation of a sequel. And equally, studios have to own the properties, and it's less of a one-man team. Even things like Community, which are so strongly a voice of one creator, it's still a giant team effort. There's no way that Dan Harmon can create that entire show by himself. And, I mean, Britain used to have this a lot more. One of the reasons we used to have 6-episode seasons in Britain is just because having one creator, one writer form the whole thing meant that writing 6 episodes was a lot better, because that's, frankly, a reasonable amount of expectation for a writer in a year, 6 episodes. And you can't do that, particularly in America, with 22 episodes a year, without your writer going totally mad. And so you need at least 4 writers if they all do 1 episode each. And then it actually takes them all slightly longer, because now they all have to coordinate with everyone else. And it just dilutes everything. Which isn't to say that American TV's bad. It's not. I love it. I think it's... I have spent most of my life watching it and enjoying it. It's just one of those things where there is a reason I hold film up on a pedestal. Some of the reason I bring this up also is because I think, for me, just in the last few weeks, while Spielberg's been promoting Ready Player One, he's sort of been making the comment that sort of Netflix films aren't the same as real theatrical release films, and that they shouldn't be allowed to get Oscars and things, which I think is ludicrous, because for me, what makes a film is to do with the fact that it's designed to be watched in one viewing, as opposed to TV shows which are designed to be watched in multiple viewings. And I feel like the other part of it is that it should have a beginning and a middle and an end and a conclusion. And I feel like that should be a bigger point. And the fact that it's a smaller, fewer writers and in theory, fewer writers, and definitely fewer directors work on a film than work on a TV show. And I think that makes a more refined vision. So for me, where someone watches it isn't the really important thing. In fact, I would prefer to make films for a service like Netflix than for a series than for the cinema, for example. I'm not a huge fan of the cinema. It is filled with other people, which for the most part I don't like. just people in general are unfortunate side effects of life. And then, like, you're sitting there, there's lots of noise all around you. Sometimes it can be quite self-conscious. For example, I regularly laugh at jokes before the actual joke happens because I can see where the joke is about to happen. But then people sort of, if I'm the only person laughing in a cinema, there's sort of a, who's that weird person laughing? And they're equally having less fun because I'm laughing before the jokes, and I'm having less fun because I feel like I'm slightly being judged by other people. So, cinemas by themselves, I'm not so fond of. Equally, for me, the time that movies have moved me the most haven't been in the cinema. Like, the time when you really want to watch a movie, when you're like, this is the real thing that I need. If you're in the mood for an action-adventure movie, it's quite rare that a really good movie of the type that you want at that point is in the cinema. One of my least... in fact, most of my dates with girls at cinemas have had an inverse quality of date to how good the movie was. So I went to go and see Moulin Rouge in the film. The date was awful, but the film was wonderful. But it wasn't necessarily... But because there were other things going on in my mind in the cinema, I was sort of like... because I was on the date, I didn't really get to enjoy the film as much as I would do later on. And I really feel like there have been moments in my life where I've watched that film and it has really meant something to me. And I think that, yeah, the ability for someone to watch a film when it's relevant to them is more important than being able to watch it with a higher screen quality. And so from my perspective, you being able to watch a film when you feel the time is right is far more important. Admittedly, things have changed a lot. Like, I am well aware that when Spielberg grew up, television was sort of 10 inches of screen was a big monitor back in those days, and people would watch their rooms were not designed for TV, so rather than having it mounted on the wall, you'd all sit a million miles away from it. And frankly, I, for example, I have a 28-inch monitor, which is what I watch most things through, and I'm sitting right in front of it, as opposed to the other side of the room. And so how big the screen is in my vision is about the same as a cinema screen. And the fact that it's 1080p is about as good a resolution as if you sit right at the back of a cinema. If you sit towards the front of the cinema, which is what I actually do, the screen is higher resolution. But sort of, if you're sitting towards... But yeah, it's like, you can get a comparable... representation that you couldn't necessarily back when he was a kid. TV and film were totally different things. So, yeah, for me, what makes a film isn't the medium in which you watch it. I mean, it's not even the medium it's recorded in, it's the way that you watch it, which is that one sitting thing. Okay, so I started off by saying that this was about books, and I'm well aware I'm 18 minutes into this chat and I've yet to talk about books. So the thing is, I'm still not going to get there. It will come, don't worry, I haven't forgotten that part. So right now, the artistic form that I'm focusing on is not film and television. The artistic medium I'm focusing on is video games. And I am video games are not my medium of choice. I enjoy video games, but video games rarely touch me in the same way that films do. And that's not to say that I don't believe that video games are an art form. In fact, I strongly believe that video games are the ultimate art form, because video games can make you question your own decisions in a way that it's very hard for films to do. Films can make you question things by telling you stories, and storytelling can make you question things, it can make you learn things, it can make you think about things, but none of that really has as strong an effect as you feeling like you went through that adventure. And by you going through a story, you can make you question your own decisions, and especially games which allow you to go through the game a second time and try things with a different outlook. That can be very powerful as an artistic medium in a way that no other medium can truly achieve other than this sort of interactive medium. Part of me has always liked the idea of making a game that right at the beginning asks you to make a choice, and then spends the rest of the game trying to convince you that whichever choice you made was the wrong choice. The idea of that sort of, you made a choice, now I'm going to ask you why you made that choice and if the other choice was correct, and then you'll go through and play from the other one going, well, clearly I made the wrong choice, and then go through and realise that both choices were tricky. Like, that's the sort of thing I'd love to do. Having said that, video games suffer even worse than TV does from the fact that it's very hard to make sure that everyone experiences the same moments. How you experience a game and how I experience a game are significantly different. And just as it takes X number of hours to binge watch all of a TV program, particularly if you want to play something like Assassin's Creed and you're like, I'm going to play all of the Assassin's Creeds, all to 100%, that takes you so much longer. And on top of that, it's like, when you completed a game, it's like, did you just play the game? Did you play the game to completion? Did you play the game a second time? Did you play the game not just to winning the game, but to 100%ing the game? Because that has a very different feel to how things work. And so there's an awful lot that can be done to... There are so many different ways to experience a video game that it's very hard to tailor the experience in the same way that some of these others do, which is why I prefer films. But I mean, no way dissing video games. It is totally an art form that can do what no other art form can. And it creates an experience and an enjoyment and a replayability. Video games, way more so than any other medium, do constantly change and can give you the closest to the first time you play, the first time you experience it. Once you've read or watched a detective program, you can never watch it for the first time again once you know the solution. Once you have played a video game, you can play it a second time and it feel different. Not just because you notice things that you didn't before, but because you can take different paths. The attitude you take, even more so with procedurally generated games. And so I'm making games right now, and I'm pretty happy with that. I'm happy doing this, and I think it's a good medium for me. I do seem to have strengths in it. And I think I'm making interesting stuff, and I have interesting plans. That said, part of me wishes I was making films. And admittedly, I want to point this out right now. This isn't like the guy who makes who made Fahrenheit and Heavy Rain, who sort of says, I want to make films, and so I'm going to try and make video games as close to films as possible. I totally understand they're separate mediums, and what I'm making in video game format is stuff that would never, ever in a million years work for in any other medium. I mean, right now, a lot of my stuff is puzzle-based. I've got a dungeon crawler that's designed. I'm not really focusing on narrative. I'm focusing much more on mechanics and making a game that feels good. And if I have any sort of narrative that comes out of these things, right now, both the game that I'm working on and the next one don't really have a narrative planned at all. The next game I'm working on, I may well end up deciding to put a narrative in, but for the most part, they're much more mechanically based, and I think that's good for a game, because I think that playing a game, for these are supposed to be entertaining mind games, by which I mean games that you have to think about as opposed to mess up your mind. It's more that sort of, I want you to think about these games, but in a puzzle format, even if it's not necessarily a straight-up puzzle game. But there's a part of me that wants to tell the stories, and particularly wants to tell stories that are not the sort of stories that come from video games, because good video games should really tell the story by letting you are playing a character, so you should be affecting the story. And a lot of the best stories, in my opinion, are stories that have been planned by someone. And letting the player do whatever they want, it's often hard to tell the same story, which is why so many of the best stories in games have been quite linear. Now, it's not the only way to tell stories, and things like Papers, Please have easily proved that storytelling being told through mechanics can be such a powerful thing. And seriously, there is a limit to what I'm allowed to talk about of my time at Nerd Cubed, because of contracts that have been signed. But I can tell you, Dan is obsessed with telling stories only through mechanics and through as few cutscenes and making mechanical decisions that affect how the story turns up, but more importantly, decisions that you didn't realize were affecting the story. And so the story becomes an organic part of your gameplay experience. That's sort of a big part of his mentality of how he wants stories to go. One of the big goals for games when we were working at Nerd Cubed was, can we try and tell... We wanted to make those games which you finish and then someone told you that there's a secret ending and you're like, what? And you didn't realise that you'd actually been making narrative decisions while you were playing the game. And it's only when someone points out that there were multiple endings that you're like, oh! And maybe you made decisions that you didn't even realise you were making, and then that makes you think about things. But obviously, as a one-man studio, my sights have been set lower, and I'm not going to lie, setting my sights a little lower means a much higher chance of games coming out. So, yeah, so I'm not trying to knock games, but part of my heart is always going to want to tell films. That said, it's so much easier for one man to make video games, not all video games, but it's much easier for one person to make their own video game than to have one person make their own film. That's very hard, particularly if you want to tell bigger scale stories, and I'm the sort of person who likes my sci-fi and fantasy, and I suppose the lowest scale I ever go is sort of like rom-coms. But sort of the things that the stories I want to tell are big stories, often with unique settings where the setting is affected by what the story is, that the setting helps tell the story. And that means original settings rather than let's go for a castle. And rather than go, oh, we can use these orc costumes that we've already got. I don't like writing that sort of fantasy. I want a fantasy where I build the rules from the ground up and slowly build the world. That world building is a huge part of the fun of what I do. So I sort of need that outlet, but production-wise, it's just impossible to get into that field. As it currently is. So one of the reasons I told you I was going to get back to this question. One of the reasons I started trying to tell this novel told through videos was because I did want to start doing more narrative work. I wanted to prove to people that I could tell stories in the hope that I could still move towards the idea of a future in film and TV. And although I am pretty happy, and at the time I started this, I was a lot less happy with sort of moving into the games industry. And now that I've got the more experience, I'm feeling a lot more comfortable working in the games industry and feeling like that I have a home there. But at the same time, my first love will always be film, and so part of me does want to tell these stories, and this was very much one of those things that I wanted as a stepping stone. And the thing is that just because it's a stepping stone, it doesn't mean that I didn't care about the project itself. The project was something that I'd been working on for a while before I knew it was a book, and I still like it. I mean, originally I'd designed it almost as a film, but then realised it was a really expensive film because it was a science fiction centre, a space station. Only all anyone did was sit around talking to everyone, so it was sort of one of those ones where it was like, really it's a play, I suppose, but I didn't really want it to be a play, and it took its time to find the right medium, and I think that's important about storytelling. I would like to get back to Surviving Tomorrow. I did put a lot of effort into it. Like, I do know what every person was addicted to and sort of how that's affecting them and how they got into those situations. This isn't a sort of, I made a whole load of claims and would work it out as I went along. I didn't know the exact plot and the order in which things would reveal themselves. But I did know roughly where I wanted things to go. I did know roughly where people had been. So nothing that was going to be revealed was going to be a surprise. Just how we got there was unplanned. And the thing is it's still kind of the perfect stepping stone for me, in that I do know the characters and I do know the background and I do know I have the foundation of that story. So I would like to go back to it at some point and retell that story. And I don't think anything better is going to take that place. And right now, that's not happening. And the reason that's not happening is because I'm totally focused on at least getting one game out. I need one game out for me to be a game designer and either potentially get a job somewhere else or set up my own game studio on a more permanent basis. That's a very important part of my future. And I will make, either later on down the line when I settled, a part of me is going to go back to that. How can I get into the film industry? And part of that's going to be I need to prove that I can tell more narrative stories. And that is probably still going to be my first step. And if it's not my first step, it will probably be my second step. I do have an alternative first step, which is... and I have been... I would kind of like to do a sort of pen and paper role-playing game type thing, which is another way of telling a story with having set up some parts of it, but also letting it organically exist. So that's possibly one option, but a part of me is always going to like telling everyone what to say. Going off on a tangent, like I wrote myself a campaign of a Star Wars role-playing game, and I wrote out seasons and character arcs over time and everything, and I realised I didn't want players to play my role-playing game because they weren't going to play the characters the way that I wanted them to, unless I kept telling them what to do, and then they weren't really playing the role-playing game. For a while, that was I even thought about doing that as a project where I'd just sort of GM and play all of the characters at the same time so that I could tell my story and roll the dice. That ended up requiring a little bit more effort than I was capable of back then. And I think that's... I'm actually in a pretty good place myself right now. And a significant part of that has been understanding what is and isn't an achievable goal in the short term. And right now I have been slowly improving what I can do as I go forward. And this podcast itself is an important part of that for me, that medium. And by limiting it to what it is, removing editing choices and things, really makes it much more doable from my side. And because of that, I'm doing really the best I've done possibly in my whole life. And a lot of that has been by taking these small steps one at a time and not trying to totally throw myself into huge projects. And I think that if I threw myself into the novel, it might just be the straw that broke the camel's back right now. So it is definitely something I'd like to get back to. Like I said, there's a strong desire in me to go through that medium. And it is a medium that is important to me. Also just because sometimes telling those stories, there is definitely an advantage to books and novels that you don't have to limit yourself in quite the same way that pretty much every other medium does. Like if you're making a video game, if you're composing music, all of the if you're making a film, all of these things sort of are limited by what you have on hand. You can't make a fully open world 3D game with real-time physics if no computer can play it and you only have one person working on it and you can only have 1 hour to work on it a week. That game will not be finished in your lifetime. And so it's a limitation. If you're composing music, you're kind of limited to what band you have. If you want to compose a piece of music for a full orchestra, you need to have access to a full orchestra. If you don't, you've just composed a piece of music that no one will ever hear, which means that it's a lot easier to write an acoustic song if you already can play that musical instrument. With books, really the only tools you need to write a story is yourself. And probably some, it's a pen and a paper or a computer with a keyboard. It's a lot simpler. I mean, for me, even with this other format, which I did like, which is sort of talking, it might just be me and a microphone. But I need these, but the scope of the story that you can tell is not limited by anything. Like, George R.R. Martin sort of made the comment that when he wrote Game of Thrones, he wrote it because he'd been working in TV for so long and film for so long that he'd got annoyed at all of the limitations that they kept setting him, and Game of Thrones was designed to be everything they won't let me do on TV. The fact that it ended up becoming a TV series is one of those little ironies that life is filled with. But yeah, so that was a much longer talk than I was planning to on am I writing a book? But also, yeah, it was just about sort of, there are different mediums and there are different ways of telling a story, and I wanted to sort of discuss that a bit. Next, I'd like to talk about SteamWorld Dig and SteamWorld Dig 2, both of which I recently picked up on a Switch sale, so I was playing the Switch editions, but SteamWorld Dig 2 is currently the freebie on Twitch Prime, so if you are a Twitch Prime or an Amazon Prime owner, then you can get those for free. But yes, so I'm very late to the game when it comes to the SteamWorld series. Having now done my research a bit more, I find out that there was a DSiWare SteamWorld game about tower defense, which no one's ever heard of. And then they decided to take this game into SteamWorld Dig, which was their first big game, which is the one that sort of became popular and I had heard of for a while. I'd mostly heard about it because I was interested in SteamWorld Heist, which when I finally got around to buying, I then didn't play very much. I've now been playing a lot more of that because I've now got it on the Switch. And it was one of those games which wasn't quite gripping enough to play it by itself, but playing it while watching something else, it's been very good at. That will be a separate review because currently I'm only just starting it, so this is really about the two Dig games. So, SteamWorld Dig 2 came out recently after that. So, SteamWorld Dig. So I'd kind of glossed over it just because it hadn't really... It had looked like it was sort of trying to be one of these procedurally generated games, and it was trying to be... I mean, really, the mechanic of digging and things falling on your head is such an old mechanic. I can't remember when it started, but it's one of the earlier video games. I mean, it's certainly NES era, but I think it was probably on Ataris before that. I don't know what the first example was, but like it's one of those classic video game tropes. And even though SteamWorld Dig did look well polished and fun and cartoony with a steampunk vibe, it hadn't particularly jumped out at me. Now, however, I kind of bought this game on the Switch, hoping it was just because I just kind of wanted a cheap arcade game, and as it was on sale, it sort of I thought that it would fulfill that job. It ended up being a bit more different than I thought it was. I mean, the essential mechanics are just your digging down, and sort of the game is make sure things don't fall on you and be aware of monsters. And it is procedurally generated, but the thing is, it's procedurally generated on creation, which is a much better version of procedural generation. And more importantly, it saves how you go down. It saves your paths. So as you go through and go down the game, you can tell sort of when you go down the second game, a second time or a third time, you start to see the path that you've taken, and your path is your own path, and you've created your own experience. And I think that's a very rewarding part of it, and is where this game starts to feel a little bit like Metroid. It also has these sort of secondary locations which you can sort of, or secondary caves, and the secondary caves are all puzzle, handcrafted sort of platforming puzzles, and very Metroidy, where you need to get the right skills and come back later on and work out how to unlock everything. So those are all very nice and satisfying. There's a vague plot to the game. I will say that, considering how little I cared for the main plot, it did have an amazing twist. In fact, it probably had one of the best twists endings I've had in seen in a video game. I won't go into what it is, but this is definitely one of the coolest twists. The sequel has the opposite thing. I'm probably going to stick more with SteamWorld 1 for talking about it now, but yes, the sequel, plot-wise, has really good characters, and I really wanted to talk to people in the second game in a way that I didn't in the first game, and I was more engaged with the plot because of the characters. But its twist at the end is boring and predictable, and overall I would say that it has the opposite effect. The twist at the ending works really well for SteamWorld Dig. The twist at the ending doesn't work so well in 2, but the telling of the story is a lot better, so the journey is so much better in SteamWorld Dig 2. So yeah, that's the plot out of the way. Going back to gameplay. I really liked the fact that you crafted your own story, and you had that sort of emergent gameplay. Really worked well for SteamWorld Dig 1. It took me a while to work out how you should be playing the game. And it was wrong. And I think they know it's wrong because they corrected it in SteamWorld Dig 2. In particular, if you play SteamWorld Dig 1, the goal is not to have any money, because if you have any money and you die, you lose money. However, your backpack can sort of store crystals, and when you die, your crystals get left behind. Which I kind of like in sort of like a Dark Souls-esque, you've got to go back to that position. However, going back to that position, I think those things that the backpack survives regardless of when you go back to it. The downside is, but yes, you lose your money, but so long as you can keep going back to where you were before and pick up your backpack, there's sort of no death penalty, which is really useful because you then have all of these. You basically just save up and then only cash in money when you want to buy something or run out of space. So that's the way that you're supposed to play it, or that's the correct way mechanically to play it. Whether they intended that or not is another matter. Yeah, overall I enjoyed this game as a sprawling sort of going through the you buy things, you pay money for upgrades, and then you keep going further, and that keep going a little bit further. The fact that you had to keep coming back as well, running out of light was a huge problem in this game because your light meter is a big deal. So you only have a certain amount of time in the cave, and sort of you have to keep running out to cash in, and that sort of keep going, retreading the same area but with slightly more stuff really was nice. One thing I will say is, and I think again they know this because in the second game they fixed this problem. One of the big problems in the first game is that you can go through and the checkpoints. That basically there are 3 main caves, and each cave has the starting entrance and a checkpoint about a third of the way down, and then you can make your own checkpoints to go throughout the cave. However, the make your own checkpoints uses a special currency, and I didn't know what the limitation of that special currency was. So, and that's the thing, because everything's procedurally generated at the beginning of the game, there's a fixed amount of money you could possibly make. There's no way of generating cash other than digging up crystals and cashing them in. And as there's X number of crystals in the entire game, it's a sort of limited resource. And so me being that sort of worried person, in particular this used sort of a secondary currency. And again, there's no way of earning these things. There's a fixed number in the game. And without knowing what that fixed number is and how many you need for all of the upgrades, you have no idea how many continue points you can make. And because of that, I never set any continue points in the entire game until I'd unlocked everything, and then only then did I start building a few continue points when it was pointless. So that was a bit of a problem. The game also sort of has this, once you work out how to game the system, it's less of an issue, but if you do cash your money in and you're not buying things, and you're trying to save up money, you can pretty quickly find yourself in an impossible spiral in this game. Because you start losing money and resources, and there's a fixed number of resources, you really only get better by spending money rather than sort of by leveling up or anything. And so you start reaching the point where you're going through the game and because really the difficulty level is depth. And if you keep dying, you then need to go further to get the same amount of upgrades that someone who was good at the game got earlier. Which actually means the game gets easier the better that you are at it, and the game gets harder the worse you are at it. Like I said, once you work out that you shouldn't cash in your money and you stop losing stuff, that becomes less of an issue. But early in the game, I was kind of aware of that sort of, oh, you're losing money, and occasionally would accidentally cash in and lose money. And And yeah, so that was a bit frustrating. Also, the ability to screw yourself and end up in the thing is that in these games, sometimes you screw yourself by going, oh no, now I can't get out again. And that's fine, but when it's a procedurally generated game, it becomes that much trickier. Sorry, not procedurally generated. When it remembers your path, it becomes that much trickier because the second time you go through, you have to make sure you make a new path into it. And particularly because there's destruction and very little construction in the game, it does actually sort of run into a bit of a problem that you can, like in theory, you can empty out an entirety of the cave with nothing but the permanent blocks. But if you do that, you can't go to most of the places that you would need to go in the game because you'd be like, oh, I need to go there. Can't do that. But I did like that. I did like the fact that it remembered, and in particular, like it even remembered the enemies. So if you killed an enemy, and killing enemies was a bitch in that game, you basically don't have a very good way of killing enemies, and you don't really gain one until right near the end, which meant that enemies were always a pain in the ass. But yeah, the fact that everything was procedural meant things like bombs that went off and took out huge portions were really annoying when you'd come through the next time because you'd then have to build around these problems. And in some ways that was fun, but it was also very tricky in this first game because, yeah, it was just that sort of hard sort of how do you get yourself out of, well, literally this hole that you've dug yourself. I mean, for the most part, you have a wall jump, so you can go up straight walls. But if you had outcroppings and things, that became very, very hard. I also like the use of water as their special meter because it meant that you could finding little pockets of water just makes sense in a cave, and for that to then fill up your special meters was useful. It was annoying though that when you went back to town, the water didn't instantly fill up because essentially I'd end up going back to town and going to the top of one of the levels where there were some water pockets and I could fill up and then going back to my checkpoint. Yeah, it was fun. It did something. And I'd already bought SteamWorld Dig 2 at this point, which is interesting because you play as a side character from the first game, a character who's almost forgettable in the first game, suddenly becomes your main character, which sort of works. Like I said, in character-wise, they did better at making all of the characters feel better. I think they got better writing as they went through the series because they had more writing in SteamWorld Heist. So they clearly learnt their lesson there. And like I said, they fixed a lot of the problems. Now when you die, you don't lose any money, which means money cashed in is safe. And what you actually lose is you lose some of the resources you'd picked up. I do think it would have been nice to still keep going down to collect your resources, but I'm mostly happy with how that worked out. The caves are now much more Metroidvania-y. There's a lot more structure has been put into them. They're all handcrafted now. It's no longer a procedural generation, as far as I know. Maybe little bits and pieces are procedurally generated, but definitely the outline of everything and the hidden sections are all hand-placed. Which means exploring everything is that much more rewarding. There are a number of collectibles, all all of which mean something. One of the collectibles unlocks new upgrades for you, and one of the collectibles you go through has gives you sort of unlock points, and it's one of those you unlock something and then you have to put points into it, but you can move your points from run to try and specialize. I always found, or nearly always found, I had enough unlock points to equip most of what I wanted. I very rarely ended up making a decision to drop something for something else. It was normally I would have sort of I want both of these things and I can only have one of them, but that was normally only one case of that, because I'd normally then fill up everything and then the new upgrade would come up, and then the things that I only slightly cared about would be deactivated and that new thing would be powered up. Admittedly, I'm a total completionist who went through and sort of, when I finish a tunnel, a mine, like when I go back through it with the jewel detector, where all of the jewels that you missed turn up on the minimap, I generally missed about 3 in the entirety of the mine. So yeah, I definitely do my fair share of making sure I hit everything. So maybe if you're less going back and backtracking, which I love doing, so was a big part of sort of, I get a new upgrade and my first reaction is, let's go back through every other level and see if there's anything I missed. And so that was definitely improved upon on this. The fairly early on, they give you an ability that they give you a grappling hook. And the grappling hook works really well because it's you can fire it straight up, and if the ceiling is within range, it will drag you towards the ceiling. And it works from side to side as well, and it's basically gets you out of that problem of everything's blown up. Oh dear, how am I going to move around? Because they give you that grappling hook becomes really useful at getting out of those problems. Also, fairly early on, it gives you an ability to a fairly frustrating problem in the first game is that really it's one of the last upgrades where you can basically you can only attack something that is next to you, which means as soon as you have an L shape, an upside down L shape. As soon as you've got that upside down L shape, you can't turn it into a T, because as soon as you go into the space of the L, of the long part of the L, you fall down and you can't sort of... So when you make sort of stairs and things for yourself, you end up stopping yourself from being able to make new trenches. With the ability to sort of hit several moves in front of you, rather than just one space in front of you, you can then make new trenches which you can sort of jump into, and it's really helpful. And they do give you that ability fairly early on. They do limit it, but limiting it is a good thing. Like, you don't want players to be reliant on it. So it's a good job they made it as limited as it was. I really like this game. It really did tick a lot of my Metroid-y feelings for a game, which is rare for me. I normally play Metroidvanias and go, oh, it doesn't do it. And even though this breaks so many of my rules of what makes a good Metroidvania, as in it is, I mean, a lot of it is still cashing in money to buy upgrades and that side of things. But that sort of excitement of trying to find out where the upgrades are and finding secrets and exploring things and finding the upgrade points or seeing where the upgrade point is and trying to work out how to get there. That was all ticked a button that rarely gets ticked in the way that ticked a button? What on earth am I talking about? Ticked a box that I'm so rarely get to tick, and it's one of my favorite boxes to tick in a game. I love that sort of discovery and that sense of excitement. So yeah, both of these games I really enjoyed, and I definitely feel like the second game added a lot more than the first game, and I really do feel like they learned a lot. I will probably play both of these games again. The first game, because it's sort of procedurally generated, I am more likely to play a second time if it wasn't procedurally generated, and I will probably play the second game again sometime in the future when I need that sort of Metroid feel to be ticked off again. But I haven't played it I need to give myself a few years before I go back and play it, but I will happily go back and play that one with all of the wonder. So I definitely think that 2 is a much better game than 1, and if you're only going to play 1 and they're not on sale, definitely go for 2 over 1. But if they do end up back on sale again, and they'll do that regularly on Steam, whether or not they do it again on the Switch anytime soon is a different matter. But yeah, they were both really good, and I don't know why it was so surprising, but I think I had that sort of hat on where it was like, everyone says this is good, but everyone are idiots. But apparently people were not idiots. They are both very good games. So there. So that's our episode. Thanks for listening. Hopefully you found that entertaining, and I will be back next week. As I said earlier, I've got a really busy week, so remember at the beginning of this where I was like, hey, I have been recording stuff. So basically everything I recorded, because I basically had 2 weeks worth of recordings, I'm basically taking half of that stuff, and that will be next week's podcast. So it should release roughly on time, even though, but it won't have any news because it will be content of ramblings from previous weeks. So that still will be happening. Part of me being busy is going to be me going to Resd. So if you're at Resd, feel free to come and say hi. And probably I will cover more about what happened at Resd. Like I said, not in the podcast straight after Resd, because that will all be pre-made content. But yes, after that, more things will happen. So look forward to seeing you then, and thanks for listening. Ta-ra!